got too many here. This is, we're going to the opposite end of the scale on this one. Can we get the first slide up? This is about, I'm giving a talk about my book, which is called Stuart, A Life Backwards. And Stuart was a homeless man I met in Cambridge when I was working at this place here, Winter Comfort. Winter Comfort is a day centre for the homeless. I began working there. I had no particular love for the homeless. I wasn't a great sort of, I wasn't against them, I wasn't for them, they were just there. But I wanted a job, and it turns out it pays quite well, the homeless do. Something that Stuart would often berate me for. And one of the jobs that I found was going at this place was for a fundraiser, where you write off and you get lots of money in and you write pieces for the local paper. And so I trotted off down there. The hours were good too, so that was another good thing. And I was working to do pieces, and one piece I had to do, so the first time I met Stuart, who was this homeless person in Cambridge, I didn't really realize much about him, but it was only later after I'd begun the book that I realized I'd actually seen him about a year before I got to know him properly. And if you put the next slide up, this was, it's a drawing I did for an article I wrote for the local paper, the Cambridge Evening News. Around about Christmas, everyone remembers that homeless people need to eat, and they could do with a bit of place to sleep, and so we want to feed them a chicken or something. So, you have an article that these newspapers are filled up with these sort of weepy articles about how we've got to be nice to homeless people. And I went out and looked around the town and went with an outreach worker. And I came across this fellow. There are a couple of distinctive things about him, which his tattoo down his right-hand arm, it says, fuck, if you can't read it, which had been, this was, he was one of what's known as the chaotic homeless. There are various types of homeless, and it's an interesting thing to study, because the general sense is that there are many ways you can become homeless, but once you get on the streets, you've got about 6 weeks to save a person. If you don't do it within those 6 weeks, you're in trouble. The person's probably, not necessarily, but probably going to stay there, because they begin to realize it's not such a bad place. You can survive. You can live there. There's a sort of community, and there's humor in it as well. And, people support each other, and there's gossip and so on. Stuart was right down at the bottom of the level. He was what's called the chaotic homeless. They have a very low life expectancy. Really, the people who work with them a lot regard it's the homelessness is irrelevant. The fact that they haven't got a home is irrelevant, really. It's the homelessness is a symptom. It is a type of disease. And the disease has a life expectancy of the sort of milder forms of cancer. It's serious. Not many people live beyond the age of 40 if they're at this level. And it's very difficult to determine what has gone on to create this person. Anyway, I went and spoke to him for this one and wrote the piece up, and didn't see him again for some while. But in the meantime, there had been a raid on this Winter Comfort place that I was working at, and the police had raided it. Now, I don't know how much people know about homelessness here, but drugs is a big issue. So everyone's taking drugs, and everyone's an alcoholic, and everyone's taking heroin and so on. And it's very, very difficult to control. And what all these places are facing is, how do you do that? How do you manage to get these drugs under control? And the two people who are running the charity Winter Comfort, where I was working on this sort of part-time basis, they tried to do various things. They'd had a report book. They would report people to the police if they caught them dealing and so on and so forth. But for some reason, the police thought they weren't doing the right thing, so they raided the place. And they arrested the woman who ran the hostel and the fellow she worked with. And for 18 months, nothing much happened. They were on bail. They were trying to organize the charity in the meantime within the regulations provided by the law. And at the end of the 18 months, it came to trial. The police moved it. I don't know if the police moved it. It was moved up to King's Lynn, which is regarded as quite a conservative little place. And they sent, well, I should just point out one thing before I say this sentence. There was no suggestion that the woman who ran this place had been involved in drugs herself. There was no suggestion that she'd been dealing drugs. There's no suggestion that she'd been profiting from drugs. There was only evidence to show that whenever she caught someone dealing, she'd send them to prison, send them to the police, and they'd end up going to prison. She had spoken in the papers about how dreadful this epidemic was that was taking over Cambridge. They sentenced her because there was drug dealing going on in the premises, which is true of all homeless places. They sentenced her to 5 years in prison. And the fellow she was with, who worked with her, they sentenced to 4 years. They'd neither of them had any previous convictions. So this is how I got to meet Stuart the second time, because I was involved in the campaign to get them out, and because I was basically the only person who didn't really mind whether I got sacked or not, I ran this campaign, because everyone's a bit nervous, what are you going to do? Someone who's sort of spilling the beans on what's going on and going against the council. So I ran the campaign, and in a meeting, it was about a third the size of this room, with, if you imagine, not quite the same type of people, but the equivalent for Cambridge. And there we all were, and we were all deciding, we were all outraged, because this is kind of like one of us had been sent to prison. And that was bad. We didn't mind. I mean, the homeless people, they were always getting sent to prison. But, one of us is kind of different, because we're trying to look after them and help them and sort them out. And so we were all outraged, and there was this big deal about how, someone knew the judge, and someone knew the prime minister, and someone knew this, that, and the other. We're all going to get them roped in. And also what we're going to do is we're going to send Ruth and John, these two people who'd been sent to prison, we're going to send them loads of books and papers and things. And it was about this point, I suppose I'd be roughly in the same position I am now, and Stuart would be about there. And this guy stands up with "fuck" tattooed down his arm, and his nose is broken, and he's got other tattoos on his hand. You'll see those in just a minute. And he says, "No, this isn't going to work. You got the wrong idea here. You don't understand about boxes, see? So you've got to understand about boxes. In prison, you've got a box, and if you go sending loads of books to the people in prison, it'll fill up their box. And then they've got to get rid of their, they're going to have to get rid of their toothbrush and their letters. Now everyone wants their letters. Look, if you don't understand about boxes, you can't run a campaign." So I thought he had to be on the campaign. So we can go to the next slide. He turned out to be a fabulous campaigner for these two people who he had known well and to whom he attributed a great many of his successful attempts to get off, a great many of his attempts to get off the street. The successes, insofar as they were successes, he gave all credit to them. And he was very good at proposing ways to bring their imprisonment to attention. And one of his suggestions was to sleep outside the Home Office. So we duly trotted down to the Home Office. And this is a scene about the Saturday. For some reason, he kind of went wrong on this one because he decided we'd do it over a weekend when the Home Office is closed. But there we were on the Saturday, you see, and that's me on the right here, and there's Stuart getting drunk. And Stuart got a little bit leery when he was drunk. Anyway, it was while I was down here at the Home Office that he and I were talking together, and I realized it'd be quite a fun thing to do, to see if you could write a biography about someone who no one would think of writing a biography about before. No one had before thought, you write biographies about footballers, you write biographies about film stars, so on, but you don't write biographies about sociopaths, drug addicts, people who spend most of their life on the street, etc., people like Stuart. And Stuart liked the idea, and we sat there, and what I've always been rather proud of about this book is that, again, there was no nobility in it. We decided it was a business arrangement. We were going to make money from it. And Stuart's idea was, he told the story, he couldn't write for toffee, I would write it, and together we'd split the proceeds, and then he'd go off and buy a flat in Swansea. I don't know why he wanted to buy a flat in Swansea, but he reckoned Swansea was the place to be. And I'd go off and, I'd rent a house in Notting Hill. There was a difference of opinions there. And so this seemed to, I was aware, I'd been aware for a long time that in Cambridge, as I'm sure in Notting Hill, the subject of homelessness quite often comes up as a general thing. What do we do about them? How do we sort them out? How do we give them more internet connections or something like that? And it was very interesting that I realized again and again at these supper party conversations, I could say, well, actually, this fellow Stuart I know, that wouldn't work in his case. And I was aware that although I hadn't known him a great deal by that time, he was providing me with all sorts of understanding, without me really knowing I'd acquired this, of the sort of, I'm not claiming a profound understanding, but of the sort of complications that were involved in a person ending up on the streets. And just how you live from day to day. It is a chaos of seconds. I mean, you don't understand what's happening at the beginning of the day, you aren't able to connect it with the end of the day. How do you manage something that's that disordered? And how do you make sense of it? And how do you make sense of how you got there? And Stuart was extremely informative on this, and also very funny. And I'd like to claim all the jokes in the book are mine, but unfortunately they're not. They're 90% of them, well, no, not 90%, 70% Stuart's. He was able to capture something about the life, and yet having spent so much time reflecting, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll stop there, because let me go on to the next slide. No, that comes in the wrong order. So we need to go on to, no, let's leave it in that. I'll adjust. So we did this campaign, and eventually it worked. After 7 months, bingo, we got him out. I claim that actually it was the lawyers that got him out. But Stuart had played an enormous part in this. And I decided that once this campaign was done and I had time, I would then set to work writing the book. And I spent roughly 2 years on it to begin with. I had an idea, I had a fancy. I wanted it to be exactly like an ordinary biography. I wanted to slot it in there between David Beckham and someone else. And I just love this idea. And Stuart, if you come to the next slide now. Yeah, this is my study. That's Stuart, that's me. And I gave the manuscript to Stuart, and he took it away and read it. And he came back. 2 years' work, remember, which a lot of time. And he said it's bollocks boring. And I have to say, I love Stuart dearly, but he came very close to ending his days then. It took everything I had to control myself, but he was right. And the reason he was right was because I tried to tell the story in a sort of, I'd lit a sort of tone creep in of, we've got to be nice to this person, there's got to be a sort of, a sort of an affection for the person, everything he does is justified, and Stuart didn't want that at all. He wanted a story about his life that told the good and the bad. He could not understand whether he was good or bad. And this was a problem that bothered him and made him, I think, unusual amongst the homeless. I'm not claiming that the streets are filled with people like Stuart. I think Stuart was a very unusual person, very eloquent, education none, but an incredible ability to use words to capture a scene quickly and effectively, and shunned cliches, but would often twist them to his advantage. Goodness gracious. Right, speed then is required here. So, I decided I'd write the book, and I would write it as he then recommended. Right, you're going to have to write it a different way. What I want you to do is write it backwards. And he said, you got the wrong idea. It's got to be like a thriller. It's got to be a sort of mystery. It's got to be like something what Tom Clancy writes. And I said, but Stuart, you're not Tom. And he said, you've got to write what murdered the boy I was. It still moves me to say that, because that's effectively what the book was, but that's effectively how he viewed his life. He began, as a child, he was known as a very friendly, very affectionate child, someone who helped a lot with the people around in the village where he lived. And something happened to him. It was quite a lot of things, actually, but something happened to him, and it was this that he wanted me to expose. I have another picture here. If you go on, this is his disapproving hand, picking out the bits he thought were a load of rubbish. Mum, he had love and hate on his fingers. The 5 dots, I'm not going to tell you what they mean. The 4 dots stands apparently for all cops are bastards. I don't know why. He thought this was a big deal. And he was tattooed all over the place. I've been slightly flustered by this rush. hang on. Let me see. Go on to the next slide. Let's see what I can do with that. Yes. So I took him up to visit my friends in Norfolk to see whether they liked him. This is my wonderful editor, who's she's my reader. She's a friend who reads all my stuff without whom I couldn't read a darn thing, write a darn thing. She's an absolute genius. And she met him, and these other characters met him, and decided it really was something I had to write about. Go on to the next slide. This is Stuart. Now, an interesting episode. I mean, the point of the book then is to gradually work back and expose the sort of things that have happened to him. And this was one thing. I don't know whether you can see. I mean, I don't want to give away the plot because it was the sense of a murder mystery. But you can see as you look at his face, you can see there's something slightly odd about the face. And one of the things he had right, I'm getting spiraled up, was muscular dystrophy. And this is just an interesting story. He rang me up. I didn't know about this. This is how I'd gradually find out what was going wrong with him. And he rang me up one day to say he was in the hospital, and could I come out? And he said he'd gone in for a cuddle. And I said, what do you mean you've gone in for a cuddle? And he said, well, it's my muscular dystrophy, and I didn't know about the muscular dystrophy. And he said, well, you see, I'd gone in for a cuddle, and trouble is I can't get it up, see? And I thought, my dick's a muscle, and I got muscular dystrophy. I might as well go in and see if I can get it fixed. And he went in, and they found his muscular dystrophy was so bad that he was at this stage very, almost close to dying. I can't go on. I've got to go on through various other things. But the book is an attempt to go through these various elements of his life and the various things that caused him to end up on the streets. And unfortunately, he can't be here tonight. He was killed about halfway through the book. He was hit by a train. I don't think it was suicide. I think it was accidental at his at the court, the thing where they investigate these things. The judge kept saying, which is quite correct, that the homeless, generally the chaotic homeless, the sort he is, when they are killed by trains, they're splattered, was his phrase, and you can usually only tell by their hands who they are. And Stuart, I think, had done what a lot of homeless people do, is just gradually increase the chances of death. And so while I knew him, he made about 2 or 3 attempts at suicide. And I think this was his way, finally, of just gradually leaving. Thank you very much.